This segment of the book commented on beliefs about women and their mental capacity in the early 20th century, and the reader found it off-putting. My response is, good, that's the point. Welcome back. I'm Emily Harris, author of STEAMY Historical Romances, and on this channel I provide all the background bits and bobs that provide me with inspiration and detail for my stories. Today, and for potentially the next couple of weeks, I am greeting you from beautiful Richmond, Virginia, which I am very excited about. I will be cobbling together more information on why I'm here and sharing some of the best portions of my trip beginning next month. So until then, I'm attempting to post snippets over on Instagram for the curious. That said, let's get to today's subject, American psychiatric asylums of the early 20th century. I mentioned this as one of my upcoming themes when I introduced my latest book, A Haunting Love, and was happily dragging my feet in putting together this video until receiving a disparaging review commenting on the topic. This, of course, forces me to dust off the old soapbox, and here we are. Now, this review had two complaints. The first was about excessive, unnecessary prose at the start, plus an apparent plethora of punctuation and typographical errors. Rest assured, I will be taking another look at the manuscript for those errors, and to the point of unnecessary prose, I give a shout out to Martha Jones over at Self-Righteousness and her video on dialogue and reader intimacy. You predicted it, my friend. As to the more interesting topic of asylums, I again direct you to Martha's channel, specifically her videos referencing T.S. Eliot and his treatment of his wife, whom he had committed to a medical facility against her will. Prior to the mid-18th century, treatment, or more accurately, dealing with anyone with mental health issues boiled down to two main options. That person was cared for by family members and potentially hidden from society depending on the extent of their illness, or they ended up on the streets and often imprisoned for their behavior. In many cases, especially if the person's behavior bordered on the more dangerous or violent, these people suffered long bouts of forced restraint and isolation. An early American example of attempts to care for the mentally ill was the creation of a small hospital in Pennsylvania by the Quakers, which included basement rooms with shackles attached to the walls for the patients. Fortunately, by the late 18th century and into the early 19th century, calls for reform and better management for the mentally ill began to surface, coupled with new procedures based on humane treatment and the idea that some of these patients could be reformed. Thomas Kirkbride, medical superintendent of the Institute of the Pennsylvania Hospital in the 1840s, developed a plan for the organization of these hospitals, which included opulent buildings with no more than 250 patients and surrounded by fresh air and sunshine. Dorothea Dix, a New England school teacher, campaigned around the country in the 1850s and 60s to promote moral treatment asylums. Once the private facilities were established, the call went out for states to provide similar care to the more poor individuals with mental illness. These facilities sprung up in almost all states by the 1870s. At no point in this history, however, did patients have the right to refuse what still often amounted to lifelong imprisonment. In the cases of women in particular, who historically were treated as the property of their husbands or fathers, until well into the 20th century, a claim of hysteria could see them locked away against their will with relative ease. By the 1890s, what had started out as mental health reform had fallen into a disreputable state once again. Mental institutions had become overcrowded, and local governments found a way of decreasing the cost of caring for the elderly by redefining senility and sending these patients to state-supported asylums. The continuing evolution of mental health treatments to include things like shock therapy and lobotomies, as well as development of new drugs and an emphasis on outpatient care, eventually saw the demise of the classic asylum. This era is still very pertinent, however, to setting the scene in several of my books. You'll remember that our hero from To Love in Silence was also considered mentally inept because of his deafness. Any illness or disability which takes away a person's ability to communicate and express themselves in a socially acceptable way has always created heightened vulnerability and opened up doors to abuse. We tend to think that in this modern age we're beyond such things, but we can only eradicate those things we force ourselves to look at and acknowledge. In the case of the comment from my reader, I believe the point was to say she disapproved of the treatment of the main character and the way in which she had to get herself out of the situation she was in. This segment of the book commented on beliefs about women and their mental capacity in the early 20th century, and the reader found it off-putting. My response is, good, that's the point. I want to make it clear that the purpose of my writing is entertainment. I'm not trying to upset anyone with the more depressing portions of my stories, but life is not all roses. And one lesson I learned from my mother, which I count most valuable next to learning to be independent, is the idea that the moment we forget or choose to ignore as irrelevant the struggles of those who came before us is the moment we open ourselves up for having hard-won rights taken away. Therefore, wherever I can add in a hint of one of these themes, I generally will. Okay, that is all for today's rant. Thank you for joining me. Please remember to like and or subscribe if you found this information interesting. I'll be back with a more lighthearted topic in about a week, so until then, happy reading.